I used to rely on driving for Uber as my main source of income in Houston, Texas. Initially, it was a side gig, but when I lost my regular job, I switched to doing it full-time. Surprisingly, it grew on me, despite the occasional frustrating passenger. One night, I picked up a man who was visibly drunk. Not an uncommon occurrence. He was in his mid-40s but dressed like a teenager with a backward baseball cap, a tight t-shirt, and a gold chain. He exuded arrogance and was obnoxious throughout the ride. Despite the attention we attracted from other drivers, I remained calm and tried to reason with him. As we approached his destination, he became even more belligerent, insulting me and refusing to calm down. Sensing the situation could escalate, I discreetly turned on my dash cam to capture the events just in case. When I finally had enough, I politely but firmly asked him to leave my vehicle. He laughed and continued to berate me, but I stood my ground and repeated my request. Eventually, despite the insults, I stood firm and repeated my request for the passenger to leave my car. As we neared his destination, the situation escalated quickly. The man reached into his waistband and pulled out a handgun, ordering me to keep driving. My heart racing, I put my hands up in a gesture of surrender. The man threatened to shoot me if I didn't comply, and I reluctantly resumed driving, trying to think of a way out of the situation. My mind raced as I considered my options, but I knew that my dashcam was recording the entire incident. When we finally arrived at the passenger's destination, I stopped the car without saying a word. The man stumbled out, leaving the back door open, and I quickly closed it before driving away. As soon as I was in a safe location, I pulled over and called the police, giving them a detailed description of the passenger and my location. I also showed them the footage from my dashcam, which allowed them to identify and arrest the passenger that same night. Although it was a frightening experience, I learned a valuable lesson about the importance of having a working dashcam. On a separate occasion, I was at a small party with friends, but when it got late, I decided to call an Uber to take me home. The house was located in a remote area, so I wanted to be safe. Since nobody else was going in my direction, I decided to take an Uber alone. I was a bit nervous as I had never taken an Uber solo before. The driver, a man in his mid-30s, arrived wearing a gray jacket and thick glasses. As we drove down a dark, deserted road, I sensed a strange tension in the air. The driver kept glancing at me through the rearview mirror, which made me feel uneasy. However, I tried to dismiss my feelings, thinking he was just checking if I was all right, or if I might damage his car as I had been drinking. But as we drove further into the countryside, the road became increasingly remote, with no streetlights to guide us. Suddenly, without any warning, the car slowed down and stopped on the side of the road. The driver got out to check the car and returned after a few minutes, saying that it had broken down. However, his behavior was alarming as he kept pacing around the car and talking to himself. When I asked if he had called for help, he ignored my question and continued pacing. Although I remained calm, I suggested calling another Uber or a taxi, but he replied that there was no cell service in the area. Upon checking my phone, I realized I had no cell service, and that's when the driver stepped in front of the back door where I was sitting. He reached towards me, and I pushed his hand away. He then made inappropriate comments that I won't repeat. I knew that I needed to get out of that car as soon as possible. I suspected that the driver was faking the car breakdown to trap me, and that he had chosen the remote spot for that reason. I quickly grabbed my bag and exited through the other door, running in the opposite direction. I had no idea where I was going, but I hoped to find my way back to my friend's house. However, after a few minutes, I noticed headlights behind me. I turned around and saw that it was the driver coming after me. He pulled up next to me and tried to convince me to get back in the car, pretending nothing had happened. I screamed for him to leave me alone, but he persisted. Thankfully, a few cars passed by, and I was able to flag down a truck. The driver, a middle-aged man, stopped and asked if I needed help. I told him what happened, and he immediately offered me a ride. As soon as the truck stopped, my Uber driver got away. As we went on the road, the truck driver told me that he'd heard of similar incidents in the area. He warned me to be careful about taking Uber rides, especially at night and especially alone. I was really grateful that he stopped. He was in the right place at the right time. Once I was home, I immediately called the cops. I gave them his information and they told me they'd look into it. As I lay in bed that night, I felt really lucky to have escaped unharmed. That was a really deserted stretch of road, so I was really lucky to find help when I did. The next day, I received a call from the police. They had found the Uber driver and arrested him. I felt relieved knowing that justice was being served and that no one else was going to go through what I did. Residing in London during my early 20s, I shared a flat with some university friends. On a typical Friday night, my roommate Josh and I joined a group of friends at a crowded bar, where we enjoyed drinks and had a great time. Around midnight, we decided to end the night and called for an Uber ride, as neither of us had driven to the bar due to consuming alcohol. Josh initiated the ride using his phone, and we waited outside the bar for a few minutes until a car pulled up to the curb. Assuming it was our Uber, I motioned for Josh to follow me, and we entered the back seat without exchanging any words with the driver. However, a few minutes into the ride, we noticed something amiss as the driver was heading in the opposite direction of our neighborhood. We exchanged concerned glances but decided not to confront the driver, assuming that he had an alternative route in mind. Soon after, we noticed that the car was unclean and had a strong cigarette odor, and the driver's GPS was turned off, with no recognizable maps guiding him. We both became increasingly apprehensive, hoping that our concerns were unfounded. Suddenly, the driver pulled into an empty parking lot in a rough-looking area of town and turned around to face us with a severe expression, large bags under his eyes and loose skin drooping from his face. "Hand over your wallets and phones," he growled, brandishing a knife. Josh and I exchanged fearful glances, each hoping that the other knew what to do. We were both young and broke. We found ourselves in a perilous situation. Frantically searching our pockets, Josh and I gave the driver our wallets and phones before he ordered us out of the car, leaving us stranded in an unfamiliar, run-down neighborhood. With no money or means of calling for help, we started walking, hoping to find a main road or gas station. As we continued, the streets grew darker and quieter, and we became increasingly lost. However, after walking for about 10 minutes, Josh recognized a street sign and thought he knew the way back to our apartment. It was a long and tiring journey, but eventually we made it back safely. When we got to our building, we were relieved to find that the driver hadn't taken our keys, and we collapsed onto our beds exhausted. The next morning, we reported the incident to the police. Unfortunately, when they checked Uber's records, they discovered that the driver did not match the description we had given them, and the car we had gotten into was not new at all. It was a common scam, and the driver had likely been waiting for drunk people like us to rob. Although he was never caught, we learned to always check before getting into an Uber and to remain vigilant. There are dishonest people like that driver who prey on vulnerable individuals, and it's important to be aware and take precautions to stay safe. Several years ago, a group of my friends and I had a night out that took a terrible turn. After attending a basketball game and visiting a few bars downtown, we decided to call an Uber to take us home. Our driver was a friendly, middle-aged man who greeted us warmly when he arrived. As we piled into the car, Jamie, one of my friends, began arguing with the driver over the route he was taking. Despite our attempts to calm him down, Jamie continued to become more and more belligerent, and the tension in the car began to escalate. Although Jamie was never violent, the driver eventually pulled over to the side of the road and turned around to confront him. Before we knew it, the driver had lunged forward and started hitting Jamie with his car keys, causing him to bleed profusely. In a panic, I opened the door and pulled Jamie to safety. It was a shocking and traumatic experience that left us all shaken. Looking back, we realized that Jamie's behavior was unacceptable and likely contributed to the driver's violent outburst. However, nothing excuses the driver's actions, and we reported the incident to the police. We also learned a valuable lesson about the importance of staying calm and respectful, especially in situations where we are dependent on others for transportation. Jamie was left bleeding from a cut above his eye and possibly other wounds as well. We immediately called the police, but by the time they arrived, the driver had fled. We stayed by the side of the road, comforting Jamie, who was whimpering in pain, until the ambulance arrived to rush him to the hospital. The police checked our ride record and managed to track down the driver, who was arrested later that night. Although we were all shaken and confused by what had happened, we were relieved that Jamie's injuries were not more serious. However, he did end up with a large scar above his eye that is still visible today, over 2 years later. Despite this traumatizing experience, we still continue to use Uber from time to time. We understand that there are dangerous individuals everywhere and do not blame Uber for what happened. Instead, we are grateful that we were able to help get a dangerous person off the streets.